I think she made a conscious decision to embrace her prettiness and her femininity and her sex appeal. And in some ways, I think that the Republican Party and her supporters gave her license to do that, because as soon as she was introduced at the Republican convention, there were conventioneers wearing buttons that said "America's hottest governor." Now, if your supporters
was part of the flow
are out there declaring that you're hot, I think that gives you license to work with it.
Well, let's talk about the men, because I think one of the interesting observations you made was that of Obama's particular look of wearing the suit without a tie, which you like.
Yeah.
Now, do you think that'll be? Would you like to see him wearing that in the White House?
Well, I think it depends on the circumstances. You know, maybe I'm old school. I think that you should be in a. I don't want to see my president in a, you know, cardigan.
No, but you know, that's not a cardigan look. And one of the things you called it, what was it that you called it, the new professional continuum?
Yeah.
And I thought that was a really interesting point, because anybody who's gone into high-end restaurants or high-end anywhere in the last 5 years has noticed that the executive man, at least the guy who's the boss, is dressing differently. He's usually the guy who's not in a tie. His lawyers, his accountants, everybody, they're all sitting around him in a tie, and he's the one at the table in the suit with no tie, or in the blazer with no tie. And it is a particular type of fashion flow that's out there happening. And I'm just wondering, could that gravitate into the White House and be okay? Or are we really not at a time when it would be appropriate for a strong fashion statement or departure?
I tend to think that in times of turmoil, and particularly economic turmoil, you sort of, there's a tendency to feel that you need to dress like you should be gainfully employed.
Like a grown-up.
To try a little bit harder, to look a little bit more polished. So I do think it would be, in some ways, disconcerting for people to see a president who wasn't in the full complement of professional business attire. I think if the times were different, then I think it could make more of a headway.
We will see him in many. We will see him in many modes, and
I mean, on the campaign, in some ways, I thought it was, you know, it was a different or an additional sort of fashion look that the men had in their arsenal. And I say that because so often, you know, in the campaign, if they're not in a suit, then they look kind of lost. And it's always sort of tragic to see them at some sort of Iowa picnic or, you know, walking through a supermarket. And, you know, they do the rolled up sleeve thing, which I always say is sort of the universal political signal of I'm being really earnest and sincere now.
Remember the lumberjack shirts when they
you know, whenever they step out of the
I'm being a
business
regular
suit,
guy.
they get into trouble.
I'm being Joe the plumber.
Exactly.
I feel for guys whenever I get invited to a black tie event in Washington, and they all show up in black tie, and the women are mostly in what they wore to the office. And well, you know,
that's deeply disturbing.
Well,
that's
there's
tragic.
women. Well, I'm not saying it's universal, but there are an awful lot of black tie events for men in Washington that probably don't need to be black tie. That could.
And the women really show up.
Well, they're dressy.
They're
dressy, but it's not the same as going and having to put on a dinner jacket.
Don't do that.
Well, I don't know. There's so many things you've got to go to. People don't always have time to. And you'll see some men who show up in suits, but I always feel for the men with the black tie, because it just seems to have, in many instances, has run its course. Michelle Obama. She's expected to make this big fashion statement. Are we putting too much expectation on her, or do you think she's just a naturally gifted, stylish person who will make a difference in American fashion without even having to try hard?
I think we're putting an extraordinary amount of pressure on her, and I think we have to look no further than election night for evidence that sometimes people crack under pressure.
Yeah. She cracked? But I love Narciso Rodriguez.
I am an enormous fan of Narciso Rodriguez. I think he's an incredibly talented designer, and I think that Michelle Obama has demonstrated really terrific taste.
Yeah.
But I do think that, you know, it's tricky. It's you know, there's a difference between dressing for real life and dressing for television, between dressing for yourself and dressing in a way that satisfies 250 million people. And I also think that she has been elevated to fashion icon at such rapid speed.
Right.
And I mean, and I actually think on relatively limited evidence.
Well, but don't you think that's because so much Kennedy aura has been applied to them anyway, that just from the beginning that they were supposed to be
Camelot with a tan.
Your words. So because she does look good, and because she has, you know, stepped up quite a few times and had a look that's all her own, people just naturally go the distance. I mean, I think they want her to be that. They want that.
Well, I think that the comparison to Jackie Kennedy is not exactly accurate. I mean, I think that we end up sort of making it seem as if Jackie owns a sheath and pearls, and anytime a woman wears a sheath and pearls, she's trying to conjure up Jackie Kennedy. I think those are, you know, classic fashion looks and have nothing to do with Jackie.
In a way that many women looked in the 1960s. It was a sort of a standard accepted.
Well, also in the way that many women look now. I mean, we've forgotten that for the last, I don't know how many years, dresses have been the fashion item. So in many ways, rather than reflecting Jackie, I think that she was reflecting a current fashion sensibility. The other thing that I would add is just that we are looking at her through the lens of a first lady, or in the past as a potential first lady. And, you know, that's a really narrow lens. And I don't mean this to be insulting, but I think that the bar is pretty low in terms of sort of fashion sensibility when it comes to first ladies. Not that we haven't had especially fashionable ones.
We have a very complicated relationship with our first ladies in fashion.
And our recent first ladies have had a very complicated relationship with fashion.
Well, or do you think Nancy Reagan's relationship was complicated?
I don't think that it was complicated enough, quite frankly.
But she had to take so much heat.
Well, she took a lot of heat because, A, she dressed in a very extravagant way. It was very well known that her clothes were quite expensive, and what we knew about them was that they seemed to be exclusively quite expensive. I mean, one of her favorite designers was James Galanos, who's known for being practically a couture designer. And then there was that nasty bit with the clothes not returned, borrowed.
But you know, what do you think? Would you think it would be a good idea if there was a program where the First Lady was provided clothing by American designers and did serve as a sort of mannequin to showcase American fashion?
I mean, I think there could be positive things to come out of that. The idea, though, of the First Lady as sort of mannequin.
First mannequin.
I find a bit hard to swallow.